I move the motion. And can I speak on it?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to speak to this motion today because I think it's about time we called out Australia's history when it comes to dealing with victims of drug rollouts approved by the government. And it isn't just about this. This is symptomatic of a long history of gaslighting of injuries. And this goes right back, just earlier this year, the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, came out and apologised to the victims of thalidomide. Well, unfortunately, they were hollow words because those people were injured 60 years ago. Why did it take 60 years for the government to apologise to the people injured by thalidomide? It was too long. But there's more people in this country that suffer every day from government neglect in terms of quality assurance of the rollout of drugs in this country. We've got the infected blood people. In the 1980s, tens of thousands of Australians, in particular children, haemophiliacs, were infected with AIDS and hepatitis C because the Red Cross and CSL refused to heat-treat the blood to make sure that the AIDS virus and hepatitis C wasn't sterilised from the blood. And the reason, as we found out in the Senate inquiry in 2004, was because the CSL didn't want to lose yield on the blood products. Okay? Well, as a result of that negligence, we have had, for decades, thousands of Australians suffer in pain and slowly die. And if you want to read a story about it, I suggest you read Bryce Courtney's April Fool's Day, where he wrote about his own son, who is a haemophiliac, who caught AIDS. And being a haemophiliac requires a lot of blood transfusions, and he went through a lifetime of suffering until he turned 18 or 19, and then one day he got a blood transfusion that contained AIDS. And of course he rapidly died within a matter of years after that, and his father and his mother had to fight the government. The New South Wales government, I do believe, did pay out some money, but it was a battle the whole time through. And then we've also got people who suffered mesh injuries in this country, and they too are still suffering today, and they are fighting to get justice from the government for the injuries that occurred to them. And I can speak on behalf of my own uncle, who in the early 1950s came down with an illness, was given a sulphur drug, and it made him blind. A 7-year-old boy was turned blind for the rest of his life, and he was given no support by the government. My grandmother had no support by the government for the drugs that were given to him. And he's battled through life. He's got a law degree with doing it through Braille, and I'm very proud of him. And it sickens me the way that people in this country and the people who are meant to protect the government, the politicians who are meant to protect the people, refuse to acknowledge the damage that they have done to Australians who thought that they were doing the right thing. They were told the vaccine was safe and effective. They were told that there was going to be a vaccine injury scheme that would protect them and look after them if they were injured by that scheme. And that is not the case. Just yesterday, I had spoke to a person who was injured by the vaccine. We actually had to turn the lights off in the office because he couldn't keep his eyes open from the brightness of the light. Now, he's not actually applying through the vaccine injury scheme, I should add. He's applying through Comcare because he worked for the Australian Health Department, and they are gaslighting their own employee. Okay? I mean, if we aren't here to protect the people, what exactly are we here for? The whole point of a liberal democracy is to protect the individual and their families from the unrestrained authority of the big end of town, whether it's the health bureaucracies, whether it's big corporations, whatever. We are meant to protect the people. And let's talk about the big corporations. Let's talk about the fines that these pharmaceutical companies have paid over the years. We've got in 2012 GlaxoSmithKline paid a fine of $3 billion. It was a criminal fine for off-label promotion, failure to disclose safety data, civil fines of paying kickbacks to physicians, making false and misleading statements. Our good friends, Pfizer, paid $2.3 billion in 2009 for off-label promotion and kickbacks. 2013, Johnson & Johnson, off-label promotion and kickbacks. Eli Lilly in 2009, off-label promotion. Abbott Laboratories in 2012, $1.5 billion, off-label promotion. And you can look it up on Wikipedia, the 20 biggest fines by pharmaceutical companies. And they all, the bottom one tops out at $345 million. And, similar thing, Medicare fraud, kickbacks. And if you look at it all through, it's all kickbacks and misleading information. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry has a history of putting their wallets in front of people's health. And the problem with that is, so we know that they're driven by the monetary incentives. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. We're all driven. We all have to put bread on the table. We understand that. But you should not trade out the safety of people when you actually do this. Drugs have been a wonderful thing, and they've made the standard of living in the Western world and even other parts of the world, the standard of living, I accept, has increased. 100 years ago, your average age of life expectancy was around 50 or 55. Today, average life expectancy is 80. We have made much medical progress in that time, and that is something to be commended. But if we want to make sure that we keep trust in our medical system, we have to protect those who have been injured by medical products. And the gaslighting that we have seen in the last 3 years, and the double standards, I'll just touch on the gaslighting first, of the people injured by vaccines is a disgrace. They've been labelled as anti-vaxxers, cookers, you name it. They rolled up their sleeves, they believed in the government, they believed the information the government gave them, thinking they were doing the right thing, and now the government has kicked them to the curb. That is not good enough. And then we have the double standards here. When it came to COVID, heaven forbid, anyone with a sniffle will have to go down and quarantine. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars on trying to protect people from COVID, which I accept is, like any virus, is a risk, especially to older people and sick people. But for the majority of the working-age people who were healthy, it wasn't a risk and it didn't warrant the unnecessary lockdowns and fear-mongering that took place. But as a result of that, we've now had massive implications in other parts of the health system. And I'll just elaborate on that. The Australian government bought 300 million doses of the various types of COVID vaccines, whilst at the same time saying that 2 doses were enough to protect you. So 25 million people times 2 is 50 million people. You could have bought 3 doses per person and had 75 million doses, a quarter of what we bought, for $8 billion. And if we'd have bought a quarter of what we bought, we would have saved $6 billion. Now, the Sunshine Coast University Hospital was built in the last decade. It cost $1.8 billion. We wasted the equivalent amount of money that could have built the equivalent of 3 Sunshine Coast University hospitals. Okay, all of this money that was spent on the COVID overreach, or not all of it, I'll take some of that back, it's a large part of it, could have been spent on front-end services, could have been spent on more nurses, more doctors, more ambulances, because heaven knows just about every state in this country is suffering under the weight of the mismanagement of the health system. I'm led to believe, I'm shooting off my hip here, I certainly know it's the case in Queensland. We have got ambulance ramping that is out of control. We've got in my own home state maternity wards closing down. Now, there was an article by the Courier Mail a few years ago that said in towns where there was no maternity ward, the number of deaths per 1,000 births was 23 in towns with no maternity ward, versus 6 in towns with a maternity ward. Now, the difference of 17 per 1,000 is probably higher than the death rate from COVID. Now imagine if we'd have kept that $6 billion plus the other billions we spent on masks and PCR testing, and I seem to recall that the Western Australian government, I think, spent $600 million just on PCR tests. How many maternity wards could have that built? How many frontline nurses? So all I'm asking for here today is to honour the recommendation by the Finance Public Administration Legislation Committee that came out earlier this week in reply to Senator Babbitt's inquiry into the Vaccine Indemnity Scheme. And this is the thing. This is coming off the back of the inquiry that looked into why pharmaceutical companies are given indemnities. I've just read out some of the fines that these pharmaceutical companies have been forced to pay because of the deceptive and misleading and unethical conduct they engage in. And yet we roll over and give them an indemnity. We give them an indemnity, and the least we could ask for is a no-fault compensation scheme, which is the recommendation from the Finance and Public Administration Committee to actually inquire into the vaccine injury scheme and to have a no-fault scheme. And the reason why that matters, and I've got an insider from the TGA, and I can't say his name, he's left it now because he doesn't want to lose his job if he goes public, who played a big role in designing this scheme. And the whole point of that scheme was once the injured person got a specialist to say that the person was injured by the vaccine, he or she would be entitled to compensation. Now, that is not happening. What is happening is Services Australia make these people who, on average, have to wait 297 days. 297 days to get a decision. These people can no longer work, or many of them can no longer work. They are seriously ill. They have to do all the legwork of trying to book in and see a specialist, a cardiologist, a rheumatologist, whatever, and that takes a lot of work. It's very expensive. You've got to go and get MRIs or something to back up your claim, and then they're basically being neglected. Now, what's happening is Services Australia make these people jump that hurdle, and what they do is then they refer it back to the TGA. And the TGA doctors are turning around and saying, we are overriding the decision of the specialists who actually examined the patient. Now, my insider tells me these doctors at the TGA are not qualified to be overriding specialists. Okay? And I believe that. If you haven't examined the patient, who are you to say that this isn't actually a vaccine injury? How would you know? And I just had a discussion this morning with some scientists who said basically you'll never know while a person's living because you can't take tissue samples from living people. So we are operating in the dark here in regards to our ability to examine what's really going on as a result of these vaccine injuries. But let me tell you this, is that these people should not be made to suffer, should not be made to suffer for following the advice of the government that said they would be protected. And we look at the TGA's track record on this. There has been 1,000 reported and, most importantly, the box that was ticked was suspected deaths from the vaccine. How many have the TGA recognised? 14. Now, over 60% of those reports came from health professionals. Now, when pressed, when you press the TGA and you say to them, can you actually prove this wasn't a vaccine, death wasn't from the vaccine, they say, no, we can't. So they are playing semantics when they say there's only been 14 deaths from the vaccine. What they're saying is, oh, we can only prove that there's 14 deaths, but they haven't examined the body. And unfortunately, in many cases, the coroner didn't get to examine the body either. Despite that being the advice from at least one state government, the Queensland state government, which if you have to get on the Wayback Machine because they've pulled this down, that said people who died from the vaccine, if you suspect a person has died from the vaccine, you need to refer it to the coroner. And of course that's not happening, but it should have happened because there were 10,000, an increase in 10,000 actual deaths in the rollout, in the 8 months after the rollout of the vaccine in May 2021 through to December 2021, before COVID was widespread in the community. and the TGA cannot explain that either. So there is plenty of information. We need to protect the people. I urge you to support this motion today and protect the people injured from the vaccine.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.